Okay, welcome everybody. We are running a little late. My apologies. After all this time in Zoom and webinars and meetings, of course, today was the day that my password had to get updated. But it doesn't make any difference. We are here together to have this conversation that I think is really important. And today I have the honor of presenting our wellness webinar on belonging and equity and how to support young people amidst continued Asian hate and discrimination. And I have two very phenomenal, experienced women who are working in this space and have personal and professional experiences to lend themselves in this this conversation today. So let me introduce who is going to be with us here today. Cassie, if you go to the next slide. So we'll have Hana Mangat with us, as she's an undergraduate student at Columbia University studying urban studies and education. She is one of the co-founders of Sikh Kid, a youth-run nonprofit organization centered around Sikh advocacy and intersectional justice. And then we also have Crystal Kim, who's a program manager from Apex for Youth in New York City, who runs a high school mentoring program for the organization. She's passionate about empowering under-resourced children and adolescents, particularly girls in the Asian American community and Asian American youth. And introducing them to caring, competent, and culturally competent mentors, which I think is an essential part of the work that we all do. So I want to thank you all for being here. As always, wellness webinars, please engage with the chat, ask questions. We will be doing Mentoring Take 2 after this conversation to answer all your questions as they come in. And so I guess I want to kick this off by having a conversation about, you know, what's at the heart of everything that it is that's been going on. And I guess my first question is, you know, Hana, as we look at everything that's been happening, what do you think the impact of COVID, the impact COVID has had in the AAIP community, specifically in the Sikh community as you see it?
Hey, well, thank you so much for the introduction, Brenda, and thank you for having us. I think that like so many other communities, like for the AAPI community, and I'll speak specifically maybe on behalf of the Sikh community and the Punjabi community, I think there's been the economic impact and then the health impact that exist separately and then converge together. Economically, like a lot of Sikh Americans, particularly in New York, are frontline workers. So whether that's taxi drivers, you know, service workers, restaurant workers, folks that really felt the economic impact hard and first, perhaps in New York. And then there's also the health impact. Like in New York City, Sikhs are concentrated in Queens, particularly in some of the areas that had the highest rates of COVID-19 infections. And, you know, across the US, Sikh Americans make up a significant amount of truckers and people that are integral to the supply chain and, you know, health workers as well. So as any community, I think that like the impact of COVID intersects with class, depending on, you know, your ability to isolate, your ability to remain healthy. But I think particularly so much of our community is grieving, and then much of the Sikh community has roots in Punjab, in India. And so as COVID rates maybe went down in the US, there was such a sharp rise in India. So I don't know anybody who didn't have a family member, you know, who was affected, or there was just such pain and trauma of the dual world of, like, you know, in the United States, perhaps as vaccinations became more readily available, you know, we saw family members and friends and loved ones in India getting sick and losing their lives. So I think that that's kind of just the synopsis of like what so much of my community has been experiencing on both ends, like here in New York, across the US, and then in India as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. And as we know, the AAPI community is so vast and large, right? And when I had the conversation with both of you, I was aware of that. But I think as I spoke to you, I started to realize how diverse and how vast the community is, and we try to compartmentalize everything, into categories. But if we're talking about India and that portion of the globe, then there's the Eastern Asian part of the globe, right? That's also being impacted. So, Crystal, tell me a little bit, as you're working with the Chinese community in New York City, the predominantly Southeastern Asian community in the city, how has that impacted both the adults and the young people that you're working with?
Sure. Thanks, Brenda. And I'll kind of add on to what Hannah was, first bringing to our attention about the, economic and health impacts that COVID, has sort of seen in our communities. In addition to those, I really want to highlight the sense of trauma more on a psyche and a relational sense that COVID has really, impacted young people and adults who identify as AAPI, specifically in New York City. And we've seen how the pandemic has completely changed the way we interact with people, sense of physical distancing and social distancing, and for young people to be so socially isolated is one thing, but then to see also accordingly the rise in very explicit, very disturbing violence across the city, across the country. I think that takes an immense psychological toll, and absolutely, in addition to the sense of loss, Hannah, that you were speaking to with just family members and loved ones, there's also a sense of the loss of your own safety, of your sense of dignity, and certainly the quarantining amplified a lot of those experiences in the past year and a half.
Yeah, and I think you're both alluding to then the big elephant in the room, right? COVID and a global pandemic comes into full reality, and then there is this huge backlash around language and origin of where this pandemic begins that starts to feed then into this huge Asian hate wave that we've experienced. And I think those, as I was talking to the both of you, I want to highlight a couple of things that I think is important in the conversation. And it's that this is not necessarily something new. It's like everything that's happened under COVID and the global pandemic while you're in quarantine, right? Health disparities have always been there. Racism has been alive and well for a minute, right? Police brutality has not been a non-existent reality in our history. But when we're all sheltered in and in view of television, right? Live and at five, like they say, then all those things surface and become more real, more concrete in people's realities and imaginations. So talk to me a little bit about, there is the global pandemic's impact on communities and what's happened to us. And then there's this reality of sort of the hate and the racism catapulting to a whole level at the same time. Hannah, what does that do to young people? What does that look like in communities? And then Crystal, you can follow right up through that conversation.
I think Crystal honestly put it really well, that like in addition to all of the anxieties that come with COVID and all of the despairs that have come with COVID, there's the added layer of like safety, of racial trauma that exists on top of it. I think that I remember I was telling Brenda this, that I was 12 years old when I started Sikh Kid to Kid with my co-founders, because the Sikh community had experienced a mass shooting by a white supremacist at a Sikh Gurdwara or temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. That was 2012. I'm 21 now, and only a couple months ago, we went through the same thing with the shooting at the FedEx Center in Indianapolis that was primarily staffed by like Sikh workers. I think that there's such a semblance of racial trauma there that is so prolonged, that has been such a core part of my adolescence, as is the case for most like young people, people of color, like folks that are minoritized. Like, and I think that what it does to young people is that it teaches us from a young age that like we're jolted into this like arena of white supremacy where we are, you know, I think like when I was 12, I was like, I'm really grateful that I got involved with Sikh Kid and we created this organization, but I think there's something to be said about like, why should 12-year-olds be explaining who they are to, you know, prevent white supremacy from killing people they love? Like that's a real question worth like answering and asking. And I think that that remains with, I spoke to a 13-year-old the other day in the Bay Area in California who's been organizing against the rise in hate against Asian elders in her community. And I think there's something to be said about, you know, how much is put on our young people to respond, to want to protect their communities, but also like, are we giving them the space to process all the hatred and those white supremacy that they are being forced to respond to. And so I think that that's one part of it. And I think another part that we'll perhaps get to later in the conversation is that also for the South Asian community and for the Sikh community, I think sometimes there's a you know, a fight to be included in the AAPI umbrella, that oftentimes that we aren't, you know, I remember after the FedEx shootings in Indianapolis, there was a lot of, you know, in the middle of us grieving our own community members' losses, there was like, well, like, is anyone going to include us in the Stop Asian Hate? Like is Twitter going to acknowledge that like this is Asian hate as well? Will CNN give us coverage? Like there's such a, you know, because racial and ethnic categories don't make any sense in the United States, like there's such a fight to be heard, I think, and to have that on top of the racial trauma, on top of the grief of COVID, is frankly exhausting. So I think that's just a little bit of what my community's been experiencing lately.
Yeah, Hannah, this sense of belonging being a constant fight, and I think there are certainly layers to that within that greater umbrella of the AAPI community. And when I think about you know, the immediate sort of turnaround from when we went down lockdown, and at Apex for Youth, there was no game plan for this. And like many mentoring programs, we just had to figure things out. And we determined that our first priority ought to be checking in with our young people and just trying our best to get a hold of them, whether it was through a text, a phone call, an email, and simply checking in and saying, hey, are you okay? You know, we're here if you just need someone to talk to. Your mentor is here. And you know, from that point on, we figured out how to transition into a virtual programming, and you know, really had to think creatively on our toes. How do we offer high quality, engaging programming online? And in addition to having to steer the program in a different way, we also noticed tremendous impact on youth, their mental health. And we found this out by administering a needs survey around this time and just trying to get information about how are young people doing. Are they concerned about, well, what are their concerns? Do they have a place to come home to at night? How are they doing with food? We had to ask questions that we didn't really ask before on the same level. And, you know, I also heard some of my mentees saying that when they tried to speak about what was happening, what they were seeing on the media with their own families, with their own parents and caregivers, and there was a lot of shush shush. And I think that's also something that exists a lot in many of our cultures, is this, you know, sort of generational trauma, and parents don't like to bring things up. But you know, I also personally, just as someone who identifies as an Asian American woman, found myself, especially after the shootings in Atlanta early this spring, just noticing that with the grief that came with that this was not an unfamiliar feeling. And in fact, I could trace back to my own early childhood, like moments that I felt that sense of real threat and not belonging and feeling like I had to really fight for my survival. So the question is now, how can we really continue to train and utilize mentorship so that we can help our youth get from this mindset of just surviving to thriving? And that's really where we're kind of trying to transition back into, you know, in-person programming into the rest of the year.
Yeah, and I appreciate that because I think one of the things that often we don't think about is how invisible certain groups of people can walk in and out of spaces, right? You're talking about an immigrant community who at times might have language barriers, who culturally have their own norms, who is trying to assimilate into this country's practices, and experiencing a lot of that and then doing it in isolation. So it's an isolation on top of an isolation, and then you have a pandemic that further isolates you. And so talk to me a little bit about, and Crystal, maybe you can keep, the thread of your thoughts around how you're getting mentors to be culturally competent. And then Hannah, as Crystal's talking about that, it makes me reflect a little bit about your organization and when you started it, that it was really sort of youth led by the grace of the adults that getting out of your way and not allowing themselves to adult. But it does take several skill sets. So Crystal, tell me how we're getting mentors ready to really do this shift, because there's a cultural nuance that you're talking about. There's a societal nuance, and then the reality of the pandemic that's all layered in.
Yeah, I think great question. Thank you, Brenda. I think just to set the stage, just for like mentoring practitioners in general, oftentimes there is just a blank palette as to like what we can bring into the curriculum, into the design of the program. And personally, at my tenure at Apex for Youth, my passion has really been highlighting Asian American identity and history, and really bringing in terms like intersectionality and what is that in relation to identity. And I'm really passionate about bringing these topics, especially for high school youth, because I learned about power and privilege and systemic oppressions in my higher education, but I thought in my college years, and maybe Hannah as an undergraduate, you can relate to some of this yourself, I just wish I had learned about this way earlier in life. And so when we bring in topics around like identity and history and sociology to young people, I think it really fits the mentoring space well, because to be an effective mentor, you don't have to be an expert in anything in particular, but you must be willing to sort of tap into your own story of who you are, what your roots are, how you got to where you are today, and where you're heading next, and to really kind of model what it looks like to be someone who's open and courageous and encouraging to a young person is just one of many reasons that mentoring, I think, is very impactful to young people. But in terms of the just cultural competence piece, Brenda, we really try to bring in the cultural specificity of like, what is it going to be like for our Apex mentors to work specifically with high school youth from New York City. I think that's also a very specific experience as someone who's not a New Yorker myself. And then really as staff, designing trainings that are touching on, not just like East Asian experiences, but really trying to broaden that out to what that means for, the, again, greater identifier of being Asian in America today, and trying to bring, to combat the silencing that has been sometimes a structure in sort of our own histories, and shedding light on how, if we understand our past and the the patterns of anti-Asian violence that we've seen hundreds and hundreds of years ago and that are still happening to this day, I think something like a big light bulb moment can happen for our young people, and that's kind of where I think a lot of amazing things can happen afterwards.
Right. I would add to that in terms of the roles of adults and mentoring. I think I'm in a funny position. So I started our organization. I co-founded it when I was 12, and I served as like president of the organization until I was about 18. Then I graduated college and started to face the reality that I was starting to no longer be a kid. And for a youth-run organization, what that meant for me was stepping back into more of an advisory role. Because what was at the crux and continues to be like kind of the foundation of our organization is the idea that young people know what they're experiencing best, and when it comes to are the realm of K through 12 education, when it comes to like teacher training and curriculum development, which is what our organization focuses on, the students in the classrooms are the ones whose voices should be amplified. And I think that in terms of how we got to that point, I do have to give a shout out to my mom. Crystal, what you were talking about in terms of just like waiting until like college to get that systemic knowledge of how oppression works and stuff. My mom in 7th grade like took me and my friends on like a civil rights tour of the Deep South to like get to understand the civil rights movement, and like having that as like my like 7th grade knowledge was definitely so integral to like my understanding of the world and my belief also in my agency to be able to do something. And I think that's like the kind of critical role that mentors play, that my mother as a mentor and some of the other adults in my life played, was that rather than telling me that this is actually what you should be doing, this is how the curriculum should be, they didn't do that, but they said rather like, this is history that you should know. Tell us how you feel, tell us what you need, tell us what you think should happen. And I think that setting up your mentees for that type of agency and helping them recognize that agency within them, especially in the AAPI community, a community where so many of us are silenced, or where we've been taught that keeping your head down is the only way to make it in the United States. Like I think that there's so much power there. And I think that like also credit to the young people who perhaps have adults that try to silence them in their lives and keep making noise, and keep saying my experience does translate to expertise. I think that's another thing, is validating that like as a young person, your experience in the classroom, or this extends to many other positionalities as well, that like your experience can translate to expertise. You don't have to have studied a topic. If you've lived it, that's also worth putting you on a panel for, or I think that's kind of what I found of like the adults, of how they were helpful as I was figuring out my like youth organizing, and kind of as I'm growing up a little, I'm trying to think about the role that I want to play in terms of the folks that are running Sikh Kid to Kid now, and the young people in my life. I think just helping them understand their agency and their capabilities is sometimes so much more impactful than we realize.
I really appreciate that, because I think that during sort of this, after George Floyd's murder, we talked about this constant racial reckoning that's happening in this country. And when people were eager to figure out, well, what's my first step, right? The work starts with you. And that's something that you are both alluding to, that the power of the young person comes from understanding their own history. But I think there's this added layer to an immigrant experience, and it's your own history and then your history here in the United States, which you might not necessarily have experience with, but you must know what happened to the Asian community as history has evolved in the United States, to really have a sense of what you might be up against, right? Because then it feels so new, it feels so isolating when you don't have that context of history, both of your own sort of identity, but what does it mean to have that identity in this country? And having the adults who are around you to be able to fortify that that seems to be a key element to finding that voice that you need to find and that fight you have to find um, in this process. And I really appreciate that, because I think many times, well, actually, as this country has a debate whether or not it should really teach its history, all aspects of its history, one of the things we have to make sure is that communities like the AAPI community doesn't get lost in that conversation, right? Because then you continue to perpetuate the invisibility. As we have this conversation, I think the other piece that we can't run away from, and I brought this up with both of you in a past organization conversation, is the connectivity and intersection between Black and Brown communities in the United States and the AAPI community specifically, and how right now some of the Asian hate that's happening is sometimes being perpetrated um, from the Black and Brown communities, Latino communities that you are a part of. And, you know, we have to start to connect the dots around that history and the complexity of that history as well. And I know that there's been a few conversations, you know, I think the Red Table on Facebook, if you haven't seen it, had a great conversation about Black and Asian relationships. As you're navigating spaces with young people and their families, and you have a Black Lives, you know, Matter movement happening, you have police brutality that's at the center of the conversation. How does that intersect with the conversations you're having with young people in your community? Go ahead, Hannah.
Go ahead, Crystal. Yeah.
I mean, I would just start off by saying that this is a messy issue, and to start to pick up the pieces and start to do some unraveling, like this is where the work begins, I think, is trying to figure things out together, and to understand and to really acknowledge and help young people process and externalize that, you know, historical structures of white supremacy, you know, the effects carry on very much to this day. Those are some of the, you know, structure that founded this country. And here we are today, right, in 2021. And while I don't have all the answers for how we can find resolutions, I do know that I put a lot of my faith and a lot of my hope for the future in our young people, in really being able to, again, amplify that this is not, we ought to come together in solidarity to combat these structures, as opposed to pointing fingers and trying to really figure out who's to blame, when actually there's so much a larger structural and systemic issues that you know, are huge factors in what we're seeing today. And so, you know, when you pose the question, I'm really thinking about this in terms of centering the youth experience. And so for mentors to come in and acknowledge that, you know, maybe they don't know the answers either. I think that's really powerful for mentors to actually say, I don't know, but let's learn together. And I think that can be a real point of connection. So that's what I would offer in terms of, you know, how young people can take charge, and how mentors can be a part of that. And as a practitioner, building up programs where part of the curriculum is around talking about these very things that are going on and that young people are witnessing today.
Right. I think that I could honestly speak about this question all day. I think a few things. I think, like Crystal was mentioning, I think history is such an important part of this conversation. And I think honestly, like in terms of the young Asian American people that I know, I think that we've honestly played a pretty critical role in educating our families and our family members on, you know, understanding systemic levels of oppression, and looking at, you know, like this is maybe your individual experience, but also this is how the system operates, and kind of always getting back to the core of white supremacy. I think that like the way white supremacy functions, right, is to pit minority groups against each other, and particularly like the model minority stereotype, you know, specifically, you know, whether that's historically allowing particular immigrants from certain Asian countries with only like certain levels of education, and then saying, well, look at this immigrant group, they're so successful, then how could racism exist? Why can't Black and Latinx communities achieve that level of wealth, of success? You know, that's white supremacy in full operation at a systems level. And I think that part of with the AAPI community, what AAPI young people, I think a critical role for us right now is to question that, to particularly if you're a child of immigrants who, for instance, for me, my parents came on those visas that kind of funded or continue to perpetuate the model minority myth. And I think the other thing is thinking about intersectionality, and that's been a huge part of what I've learned from the AAPI community in New York, that the experience of perhaps, you know, where I grew up in the suburbs of DC is very different from those of the same ethnic background of me, of a very different class, who grew up in like Richmond Hill, Queens. Like, it's a very different experience. And I think that we have to be also speaking about, you know, the, you know, Southeast Asian communities experience is so different than perhaps the Indian American or Chinese American community. And I think that when we kind of can have those more critical discussions, the solidarity that we need to be showing up with, perhaps for the Black and Latinx communities, makes a lot more sense. And I think there's Ruth Wilson Gilmore. She's like a famous, well-known abolitionist. She says it really well. She says, I don't want to misquote, but she says that right now there's a hyper focus of when police are killing Black people, but police are also killing other people. And as somebody whose family has experienced police violence, and I know of many Asian American communities in New York, particularly the undocumented Asian American community that has experienced police violence, I think that's such a critical thing. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, like, when we can get police to stop, you know, brutalizing Black communities, these are the other communities that will also be helped, that quality of life improves for everyone. And I think that that's such a core aspect of what we have to be remembering in these conversations, that you know, first of all, the intersectionality, that different Asian Americans are experiencing systems of policing differently depending on their immigration status, depending on their class, depending on where they live, and how that, you know, functions in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, that it is a movement that improves quality of life for everyone, and we can't be fooled by the systems of white supremacy that tell us we're going to lose something, and that will no longer be the model minority if we're standing in solidarity with these communities.
I really appreciate that, because you know that this is a conversation I brought up specifically because of that. I think at the root of it, even as a, you know, as a Puerto Rican woman in New York City, I'm very clear about the intersectionalities of immigrant communities and the complexities of how systems actually create the pitting of one community off the other, right? Whether it's housing, how we get small business loans into communities, how small businesses can be built. All of those pieces actually are systemic, that then create these schisms in our community, because we also have to understand each other's cultures in order to be able to then understand why we behave certain ways, right? And there are times where it's like, oh, they're so loud, or they're just so touchy feeling, oh, they're so aloof. But that's all cultural in its, you know, very nature, in the sense of the way that you practice socially amongst family and friends or in community. And so I think that that creates a different complexity that we have to be aware of as well. As you're looking at this, and we talk about people, how mechanisms that are in play, people are coming back together in the fall in school. They're coming into the same buildings with everyone after this experience. There's going to be trauma that comes in every direction. There'll be fears. What are some things that you think that we should start doing over this summer to start helping young people really, you know, get ready to have that social sort of tsunami happen in their life? Um, Secondly, how they have agency and power in some of the situations that they may be confronting as they go back to school and into the community as such. Go ahead, Crystal.
Sure. In terms of what mentors can start to do actively in preparation for back to school, back to in-person, just life and school and community in general, I think it's to firstly just observe you know, your young person and really try to get under the layers of, like, you know, beyond when you ask, how are you doing? And if they just say, I'm good, I'm okay, being willing to dig a little bit deeper and asking really good questions about, you know, exactly what you were mentioning just now, Brenda, about, well, what are you excited for? But also, what are you nervous about, right? If anything, what are some of the fears that you're sort of like navigating right now? Because it's going to be very unprecedented going back to school after what's happened in these last few years. And I think that, I mean, I'm thinking right now a lot about what Hannah was saying about what it means to center youth voices and to not be that adult and be like, you know, I've lived a little bit longer, I've had different experiences, so I know what's best for you. Avoiding that approach entirely and really being as encouraging, compassionate, and patient as one can be, because you know, we're starting to all come out of lockdown physically, but again, very psychologically and relationally as well. And it may take time if you've been a mentoring parent for a while to kind of get back to where you were before, or if you met your partner, your mentee or mentor during virtual times, figuring out how do you transition your relationship best into kind of these in-person times. And I would also add that, you know, adults, caring adults, mentors specifically affiliated with formal mentoring programs don't need to feel like they need to have all the answers and they don't need to figure it all out themselves. You know, collaborate with staff, ask for support. I often hear questions from mentors, you know, is this appropriate to share? Or am I being too naggy if I ask about this? And I think it's really important to talk through these concerns because oftentimes those questions are actually really powerful to, you know, be vulnerable with that young person. So taking confidence as adults in knowing that, you know, we have the tools and we can also tap into like our own stories so that we can be available and present, not perfect, with young people who are really looking for some sounding boards. And you know, sometimes it's enough to just ask, do you want to vent or do you want advice on this, right? And to kind of go from there, but really centering what that young person is needing in that moment and really building the foundation so you can get a sense of what that need is.
I would definitely agree with that. And I think that there is also so much power in hearing vulnerability from an adult. Like, I think that, like, from what Crystal was saying, that like sometimes it is really helpful to hear someone say, no, I've experienced that too, like your emotions are valid. I think in particular for this fall, for the return as a student, I think I have some opinions. I don't know a single student right now, and hopefully this is just college, but I imagine it extends to high school as well, of students who aren't burnt out. I think all of us are incredibly burnt out, particularly because so much of our academic demands remain the same, even though the world around us completely changed or fell apart. And I think that because of that, my like call to action for mentors, for teachers, for administrators would be to find and to create spaces for folks to heal and to process. And you know, like I understand that the United States is opening back up now, but we also crossed 600,000 deaths. Like for people to grieve, I think that the biggest fault that schools often expect of young people is for us to continue and like leave our lives at the door and just like come in and learn. And I think that like most of us know that the best learning happens when you can bring your full self to the table. So just creating those spaces and continuing to talk about, the rise in AAPI hate, the Black Lives Matter movement. I think it's also important to create spaces for students and young people to acknowledge what they're feeling about those movements and find ways to, not just have it be a blip in like, the summer of 2020 was the summer of protest, like to figure out what that change looks like in the classroom or in mentoring spaces is equally vital. So I think just, making sure we don't pretend like nothing ever happened and we're all coming back to normal is the most important part, to make sure we're letting people process and be their full selves.
I think that's so important. We talk about often, how do we create spaces of joy for young people as we're going into the fall? There's been so much loss and trauma on so many different layers. You can't even imagine which ones have impacted some young people, all young people. And so don't assume, just assume that everybody is going to need some love and healing in the process in order to move forward, I think is a really important piece to understand. One of the things that I'd love to continue the conversation about is sort of, what do you think that most people need to understand about the AAPI community? I think that there are some nuances to the communities that exist that I think are important for folks to understand. And we've had this conversation in many ways. I think, Hannah, when you started your organization, there was this huge misconception that Sikhs were Muslims or were part of the 9/11 terror attacks or, put whatever other craziness people say in order to devalue another human. Um, Krista, I think the Southeast Asian community is experiencing it now in many ways with this whole, you brought the pandemic, where it started, the origin, and all this. Um, but there's some nuances around how culture and um, individuals come to the table. What should we know? Because I think that that's really an important piece as you're interacting with the world. I think for a long time, the community's been invisible. People have a lot of stereotypical thinking or not enough knowledge. So I know you don't represent every community in the AAPI community, but if you would want some of the simple things that we should be knowing and super aware of as we engage, as a Latina woman, as I engage in the Asian community, what should I know?
I love this question. So what should we know? What should people understand about kind of AAPI people, about the communities? Well, the first thing I think that comes to mind for me is that we've been here for a long time. I think this really comes out of my desire to dismantle the perpetual foreigner stereotype often associated with people of Asian descent, is that inherently we do not belong here, or that we're here for a short term, or that our real home is across the waters elsewhere. And I would want people to know that we were a part of creating this country, building it up from the ground up, but also that there is pain, there is sorrow, and a lot of the history of Asian America is starting to really get more traction now and have more visibility, but there absolutely are just stories within each individual person and their own personal histories. I remember talking with you a little bit earlier, Brenda, about just the experience of growing up as an Army brat, and growing up as an Asian American Army brat was something that was very singularly unique to my understanding over time of what it means to be a person of color, because I did not know that I was a person of color until I went to college, when I had a conversation with someone who said, but you're not a person of color, you're not, like, your skin tone, right? So I had to grapple with my own personal history and what people were telling me I was and I was not, But if I had to boil it down to an essence, I would want people to know that, you know, we are Americans as well, and that, you know, if you ask people about their lives and about their histories and how they got here and what they've done and their families, I think people would find that we're so much more connected and so much more alike than we are not.
I think, yeah, I agree with everything Crystal said. And what I would add is that the AAPI community is very diverse. I think that people, you know, don't really seem to understand that. And I think that, you know, a really good example of that, you know, is Crystal saying like that she didn't know she was a person of color until college. I think that like most South, like Asian Americans had a really different experience because post 9/11, you know, we were racialized in a really particular way. And, you know, my community, the Sikh community, where so the religion has articles of faith that are very visible, that many folks tie turbans, a lot of people have beards, and then the brown skin, that it's you're racialized in such a particular way because of the way the United States government responded during 9/11 and after 9/11. And when we talk about, you know, Brenda, what you were saying, like the Sikh community is so often mistaken for the Muslim community, there's such a difficult balance to walk because it's, you know, I was telling you this, that like a big belief of the Sikh community is that we're never going to deflect hate onto another group, but at the same time we deserve to have our own individual identity, our history, our religion be respected as an autonomous, you know, thing that exists independently of other religions. And I think that that's a line that we're constantly walking. And I think the other thing I would add, in addition to what Crystal said, for sure, I think for my dad, it was really important to me that I would know that, like, you know, Asian Americans have been here for so long, Sikh Americans have been in the US since like the 1800s. And I think that that historical aspect is often erased, particularly, you know, when it comes to immigration history. It wasn't until college that I read, you know, these Supreme Court cases where Asian Americans were arguing for their citizenship, or learning more about that. And I think even as well as like immigration history, understanding why, you know, in New York City, for instance, like I believe Asian Americans are a huge group that are experiencing poverty. I don't want to misquote the statistic, but I believe they're the racial group that experience poverty at the largest rates in New York City. And like you would never know that by the model minority stereotype that's pushed, right? So like I think that understanding the diversity of the community, and then also the like history of the policies and the ways that, you know, Filipino Americans in the United States have a very different history of how they entered the country than perhaps like Indian Americans. And I think that understanding that diversity makes it so that you don't just stereotype a person and their experience and their community's experience, but rather can understand, you know, the way they're experiencing this country.
Yeah, the level of curiosity and education that we need to embark upon in order to start loving one another is very real, right? It's not lost on me how we have to enter spaces. And to your point, Crystal, and you've mentioned this, Hannah, ask the questions. It's like, you know, there's the statement of there's never a stupid question. If you do it with a level of sensitivity, there's definitely never a stupid question, right? So explain to me why you wear that headdress specifically. I'm unaware, and letting people know where you're sitting so that they can then respond with a level of empathy and also with excitement that you want to know who they are as an individual is such a big part of this whole piece as well. And I think it's this place where we can encourage young people to become those types of curious individuals about who their friends are, because I think a lot of times they have friends and they don't necessarily say, oh, you're from the AAPI community and you're this, you know, they just like the same music and that's just Hannah, you know. And but there's some benefit in sort of understanding who Hannah is and who her family is so that you can then evolve and understand the world around you. And I think that's such a big part of also what we can do as adults is to encourage those conversations and that curiosity to elevate things for, young people. Look, we're experiencing to a certain extent a collective trauma across the board, right, in discovery and reality through a global pandemic and racial injustice. And that's a generational one. Talk to me a little bit about, we've alluded to this, a lot of the hate crimes that are happening is in your elder community. And how are young people reacting to that? What does that look like for them as far as a concern, as a anxiety, as a tension? I want to elevate that because that's really important. I think one of the things I know about the AAPI community is that it is very generational in nature. And then when we look at the pandemic and the disparities, homes are filled with multi-generational individuals, right? And this is why the pandemic in those communities, similar to the Latino community, become grave, right? Because your young person is the one who's asymptomatic, affecting all the older generations, and it's a spiral, right? So talk to me a little bit about some of the impacts that you see and what we should be aware of, because that's a huge part of the identity of a young person as well. Hannah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think what comes to mind is I had shared this with Brenda. So in the shooting in the Indianapolis FedEx facility, one of my best friend's grandfathers was in that shooting, and he fortunately, survived. But it was just such a traumatic moment for the family, for everybody, obviously, and I think that something that we've kind of been learning about our community members, elders, as we've been processing is the role intergenerational trauma plays. Like a lot of Sikh Americans in the United States immigrated to the US because they fled genocide in India, and so having that on top of post 9/11 racial profiling, unlawful detention of folks that tied turbans, on top of the everyday hate crime that now consists of mass shootings, right, or of violence against elders. I think what we saw from that and what we've seen in our elders is that for them, maybe there's this lesson that's been taught through intergenerational trauma that this is just the way it is. And I think sometimes there's so much pain in seeing that, like, your grandfather has experienced that the elder folks in your community have experienced that, and they don't expect better from the community or from their surrounding area because they've been taught, well, this is just the way it is. You keep your head down and you keep working. And I think that from what I've seen of my loved ones, of my friends, of my family, I think sometimes that pain and trauma is deflected onto the young people that have the audacity to be the Americans, to say, no, this isn't how it's supposed to be, that I belong here. My grandfather belongs here just as much as, anyone else. And I think that there needs to be, in my opinion, space for us to express that, for us to also acknowledgement that we don't just hold our own trauma, we hold our grandparents, our parents' traumas as well, especially if they haven't been, given the tools, the mental health care to be able to process it. Like from almost every young AAPI person I know, we're the ones that often also carry it with us. And I think that just acknowledging that, for mentors to know that, to make space for that, to say, how was, dinner at your grandparents? Did they bring up the shooting? Did they bring up this? How are you feeling about it? Like, those are questions to ask because we're often processing for more than one member of our family.
Mm. Yeah, I really resonate with what you're sharing here, and I think your share really captures how like kind of generational differences and even age as an identifier is very prevalent in many Asian American communities, and because there's been so much loss accrued, loss of lives, loss of the sense of safety, loss of joy and connection, with everything that has occurred in the last year and a half in particular, I think it's so important for mentors to fill that gap by creating space and thinking about space as very much a relational thing, not necessarily a physical space, but more along the lines of community building. And I think helping young people understand that, all of our ancestral lines and histories are unique and different, but trying to do a little bit of that unraveling together. And I think the mentor must be willing to lean into that discomfort of also doing their own historical unpacking, their own self-edification around what has happened in my own history that, brought me to where I am today. And I think in my experience, I've seen that there is a lot of silencing and self-silencing, and just, it's triggering, and it's very difficult to bring things up, I think, for older generations. And that can be confusing, that can be frustrating for teenagers. So for mentors to come in and say, let's share stories together, and especially let's talk about the struggles and the things that are shaming, right? The things that are kind of in the dark closet. I think ultimately being honest with one another and authentic with one another is what is going to slowly lead back to healing, that genuine sense of connection that we can provide to young people through these mentors who are consistent and collaborative and willing to be real with how they're feeling, where they've been, and to help young people channel their energies by figuring out what level of change do you want to enact, right? How can we turn all of this violence and hardship and struggle into your own purpose, right? And I think that's sort of the next step that mentors can really level up in their mentoring relationship.
I really love that, because I think it's a spectrum of what needs to happen, right? It's not always staying in the doom and gloom, but to your point, Hannah, the acknowledgement that it's not only their pain, it is a collective pain that young people are carrying, which adds a layer of complexity. I also think you have to process pain and understand that when you're coming from a space where you're not allowed to process pain, it takes time to convince the person that that space that you were talking about, that relational space, is allowed, and that it's a safe space for them to be able to do that, and not one that's going to judge that they did that. And then how do you take all that energy, to your point, and then put it into action? And I think that that's the other piece that's super important. We know that all movements in this country of activism were generated by young people. And so as the adults, it can't be any surprise that there's something percolating here that's going to rise and say, it's enough. We don't want this anymore. And we have to get ready for that. Because I think it's coming in full force in the fall if our predictions are correct around how dynamic and wonderful young people can be. So I think this is our time. We're going to go to Mentoring Take Two to answer our questions from our audience, but I really appreciate you taking the time. This is really hard for me to ask you to do, because I know that you don't represent every human being in the AAPI community, but I thought it was really important to have the understanding that the cross-section that exists within our Asian American Pacific Island community here in the United States, how complex these issues are. And to your point, Hannah, which you reminded me when we started these conversations to today, I always appreciate the courage to say, and the root of it comes from white supremacy, that as we're looking at each other and saying, well, they didn't do this and they didn't do that, that the connecting force is that we're under systems that actually marginalize people. And until we start getting to the root of that, this conversation will always be superficial, because the work that needs to get done doesn't get done. So I'm really great that I have partners in crimes and looking at systems and disrupting. I always say I don't want to be an ally, I got to be a co-conspirator. So always happy to be somewhere co-conspirating, but I really appreciate the time both of you have given us. I'm always honored. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much for joining the wellness webinar. I think one of our staff right now is going to pull up the Q code so that you can grab your camera really quickly and take a survey to talk about our conversation. We hope that you've been able to put some questions in the chat, and we'll see the both of you in Mentoring Take 2. And thank you to our audience. We'll be sending out recordings to all of you to answer your questions. Have a great day.